welcome back. My name is Rubio, and on behalf of Global Genes, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to this session on the future of engagement is hybrid and expensive, digital strategy for the new normal. The past year has forced all organizations and nonprofits and patients and caregivers to react to, and clinicians as well, to reevaluate their approach to patient engagement and education, to community events and conferences, and maybe most importantly, how we stay in touch with and address our community's needs. As we look to the future, the imperative to develop robust engagement approaches to continuously evolve our approach to inclusivity across the board is clear. And we've heard it said that while healthcare is not a linear episodic experience. That really is an outdated understanding from a clinician's perspective of what a patient or caregiver lives. It's actually an ongoing cycle of engagement that when we put patients and caregivers at the center, we begin to understand much more and better and respond to many more of their needs. The same can be said for the ways in which we engage our own communities. So today we'll be focusing the conversation a bit more on those kinds of experiences and what we've learned throughout this period. So joining us today are Trisha Varadia, Ambassador of the MS Society UK, ADD International, and Lifebulb, and Kelly Conway, the International Autoimmune and Inflammatory Arthritis and AiArthritis Voices. Kelly has lived with autoimmune arthritis since her teens, but wasn't diagnosed until her early 30s. Though through social media, she connected with other patient advocates to co-found the nonprofit AiArthritis in 2013. She advocates for the patient voice on Capitol Hill in the medical community and through her nonprofit. Professionally, Kelly works as a speech-language pathologist and is a published author and writes the blog As My Joints Turn, My Autoimmune Soap Opera. Trisha Varadia is a multi-award winning advocate and patient engagement consultant from the UK and works nationally and internationally to embed the patient voice into the healthcare ecosystem and medicine's development life cycle. She's particularly passionate about good patient engagement practices and diversity issues in healthcare and improving health literacy. So I'd like to welcome now Trishna to introduce herself, her story, and like Kelly after her, I'm going to offer her challenge also to speak to some of her biggest challenges during the pandemic, as well as what she's identified as opportunities to improve patient engagement.
Thanks, Christian. It's a pleasure to be here today. So hi, everyone, and thanks to Global Genes, particularly for asking me to participate in this discussion today. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm Trisha Varadia. I'm based in the United Kingdom. I live with several chronic health conditions, but it was my diagnosis with multiple sclerosis back in 2008 at the age of 28 that really got me involved in advocacy. As Christian mentioned, I now work across disease areas, so not just in MS. I work nationally and internationally to embed the patient voice across the healthcare journey and the medicine development lifecycle. So that includes working with multiple stakeholders, such as industry, patient organizations, clinicians, and healthcare systems, and also doing a variety of different things. So that could include consultancy, writing, media outreach, and also the development of solutions, services, and information. So Christian was talking about the challenges and opportunities that have been posed, particularly in the last sort of 18 months to 2 years. For me, one of the biggest challenges during this pandemic was trying to navigate healthcare when the whole of my household is considered clinically vulnerable to COVID. So I live with my parents and my younger sister. We're known in the UK as a shielding household due to the fact that my sister and my mum are both extremely clinically vulnerable to COVID. And my dad and I are clinically vulnerable. So both my parents are over 70, have their own health issues. My younger sister is immunosuppressed. She lives with inflammatory bowel disease and is taking an immunosuppressant medication. So for the past 18 months, we've been shielding, which basically means not leaving the house apart from for medical appointments. And even though we're all double vaccinated now, we're still shielding because my sister is on a medication that may have decreased her antibody response to the vaccine. So although we're jabbed and the restrictions in the UK are more or less completely lifted, we're still doing the same as what we've done since the start of the pandemic. So as I said, this is meant for over 18 months. We've only left the house to attend medical appointments. As a result, what that's meant is we've really had to think about whether we can essentially risk to go into a hospital setting or to the doctors or to the dentist. Whilst there might have been a willingness by the National Health Service, so that's the NHS in the UK, to incorporate technology to help counteract this, the IT infrastructure hasn't necessarily supported it. And I think that's been a real challenge. Never once have we been offered a video consultation, although in theory, every clinician should have access to this as an option. My dad has recently been diagnosed with cancer. He was told this over the telephone. It wasn't even a face-to-face appointment, not a face-to-screen appointment. He was told he had cancer over the phone. We asked for a video consultation for one of his appointments, and we were told it wasn't possible. So we're now having to risk making face-to-face appointments and going to the hospital to see a consultant when actually we would prefer to have that safety of, seeing somebody over a screen. So matching needs and willingness with the practical infrastructure that's needed, I think has been a real challenge. Having said that, I do think there's been some big opportunities created by technology. And one of these opportunities has been to improve patient engagement and broaden this out to more people and more diverse communities. So there's traditionally been a problem with attracting diverse patient groups to participate in engagement opportunities. And this has been experienced by patient associations and industry alike. It's tended to always be the same people or the same types of people who've always been engaged. But because things have gone virtual, I've seen more people getting involved. I've seen different people getting involved. The volume of my patient engagement work has, I'd say, probably tripled or even quadrupled after everything shifted online. I've been able to work with different organizations and across different geographies. I've also been able to participate in activities that wouldn't have necessarily been possible in person. So last year, I spoke at 2 conferences for Brazilian organizations within the space of 6 weeks. I never have managed that in person. I couldn't just fly to Brazil twice in 6 weeks, as lovely as that might have been. That just wouldn't have been physically possible for me. So there's been a definite opportunity there. We just need to make sure that we continue to leverage it. And I'm excited to be discussing this today with Christian and Kelly. And Kelly, I know we're going to be hearing from you next.
That's right. Hello. And I really appreciate the opportunity to join Trishna and Christian today. I'm thrilled to be here. Again, my name is Kelly Conway. I began showing symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis at the age of 14. I wasn't diagnosed formally until around age 31 or 32, so around 2002. So I went a huge chunk of my life experiencing symptoms and finding no relief. Then in 2009, suddenly social media exploded. And by going online and seeing things on Twitter and Facebook, I realized my story of years and years of not knowing what was wrong with me was not as unique as I thought it was. There were a lot of people out there. So through my experience on social media, I met other patients like me who kind of felt alone and isolated. And we joined together. And then in 2013, we started the International Foundation for Autoimmune and Autoinflammatory Arthritis, which we now call AiArthritis. We got together because we realized the one thing that was really missing was education about our diseases, advocacy for policies that have to do with our medications and access to healthcare, and also patient-centered research. The patient voice is something that's very important to me. So we've been a global virtual nonprofit for years. So when the pandemic shut all the brick and mortar buildings down, our organization was already up online and primarily online. So we were able to put together some good information for outreach. So we were able to use that very effectively. I always say none of us want to grow up to be patient advocates. There's no college program. There's no training. There are some programs now. Once you get involved, people might help you out and you might be connected with some programs, but there really is, nobody grows up to want to be a patient advocate because you're diagnosed with something. It's just something that happened. When COVID came, my family, like Trishna, very high risk. I take an immunosuppressant drug. My father was 84 and he was living with multiple issues and, advanced in age. He was also disabled. My mother lives with COPD and other health issues. So we did what we thought was right. We took all the precautions. They let no one in their house. I did go spend 2 weeks with them. And prior to going, I quarantined for 2 weeks. We did everything possible. As a speech language pathologist, I work in a school and my job transitioned to virtual. So I sort of had to make a complete change of how I provided therapy in 2 seconds. It was extremely stressful. So we were doing what we could to stay safe. And then my mom reminded me it's a year ago tomorrow. My father fell and he broke his hip. And that led us on a journey of he needed surgery. He was unable to come home. So we had to place him into a rehab setting for him to receive occupational therapy and physical therapy. He was in the facility 3 weeks and we started getting the phone calls that there was COVID in the building. We tried to get him out to get him someplace else. But apparently at that time, nobody would take anybody with exposure to COVID, and most of the rehab facilities and nursing homes in the area were also experiencing COVID situations. So after 3 weeks, we got the phone call that we were dreading. My dad was unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital and he had COVID. He fought it for 3 weeks and he lost his battle on November 10th. So in terms of technology, it's critical. The last days of my dad's life, it was getting glimpses of him on an iPad when we could get it to work. I would have nurses who'd say, "Oh, I'd love for you to talk to your dad today, but unfortunately, I don't know how to work an iPad." And some people find that an outrageous statement, but again, you don't go to school to become a nurse to work an iPad. And when I thought about how they had to dress and undress to go into my father's room each and every time, I couldn't be mad. My father died on a Tuesday, and I got a phone call the following Wednesday. My mom's only brother, who also had COPD, who was 78, I believe, he also fell, and we needed to put him into a physical rehab center. They were all filled with COVID, so he was placed into a nursing home that was COVID-free. Turned out COVID just spread through the building. 3 weeks after my dad died, my uncle also died from COVID. So again, it was the inability to be able to be with them as they were ending their lives. The technology wasn't working for a few reasons. One, people didn't know how to work it. Two, they couldn't get it to work because the reception in the building or the Wi-Fi wasn't strong enough to get it to work. And three, they were just overwhelmed with patient care. So technology can be a great resource, but I think the infrastructure is not there to meet the needs of everybody. And I think we're going to talk more about that as we move forward. Because again, through my work in advocacy years ago, I met a woman from Montana who had a very rare disease and her doctor was located in Nebraska. And I believe she said it was like a 9 to 10 hour trip to see him. Can you imagine having to drive that far? My nephew has ankylosing spondylitis, and they were told, you're so lucky that you live in the Philadelphia area because we have multiple pediatric rheumatologists. Other parts of the country don't have that. And I remember thinking at the time, wouldn't it be amazing if there could be remote appointments where a doctor can maybe rent out space, a specialist can rent out space in a doctor's office where a physician's assistant or a doctor work together, do the physical exam, and then the specialist comes in and they come up with a program, and then the stress of having to travel would be taken out. I did a podcast with a dear friend of mine talking about everything going to virtual, and she said, this is something patients have been begging for years. And suddenly the pandemic comes and all of a sudden it's accessible. And it was accessible, but again, the infrastructure was not in place. So I think that's something that we can talk about further as we move forward in our discussion today.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. And, I think all of our hearts go out to you and to your family for the losses you've endured. And Trishna, of course, like so many of our families, we really stand in common experience and solidarity with the challenges of living life limited. And hopefully, if anything, we've developed a sense of empathy, or we're sharing a greater sense of empathy in society when people have all experienced what it meant to be isolated for a time. So with that, I did want to raise one opportunity that I think both of you talked about, was this opportunity for education. Kelly, I'll start with you because you really got into two different audiences there of healthcare professionals, as well as patients and caregivers. So I wanted to see if, how you got into a little bit about how to use tech more effectively in medical care. I wanted to see if you wanted to elaborate anything more on the clinician side.
Sure. Well, it was actually my experience with patient advocacy that prepared me a little bit more for working on Zoom for the digital therapy. I had been using Zoom for years. And I remember when everything shut down and people were talking about Zoom, so many people saying, what is Zoom? And it was something that I was fairly familiar with. I had my own account. I was surprised people didn't know, but I think if you didn't have a reason to use it, you would have never known. So I at least had knowledge of how to do it from doing conferences like this, from participating in speaking events where I had to do things virtually. So I felt like I was okay with the technology piece, but a lot of people were not. A lot of teachers were not. And we went from being in person to being so separate. And, I always joke that most of my kids, I saw them from the forehead up because they didn't want to be on camera. That was another thing. People didn't want to be on camera. So I think the education piece, I know teachers, doctors, therapists, we all got thrown into it very quickly. At one point, my dad's doctor was trying to use the HIPAA platform that they were using in the hospital to contact us. And she couldn't get reception. And she called me on my phone and said, can I FaceTime you? And I'm like, absolutely. So technically it wasn't HIPAA proof, it wasn't HIPAA approved, but I wanted to see my dad, and it was one of the last times I did actually get to speak to him. And his last words to me were, I love you. And I'm so grateful she gave me that moment. And she didn't say, well, I can't use my phone. It's not HIPAA approved. And I promised you guys I wouldn't cry, and it didn't kind of work. But, the education piece and making sure the platforms that are approved, that are safe, are also providing access. The platform they were using wasn't giving us access, or it was giving us access on a limited ability where, people were desperate to reach out. So as a therapist, I had to learn how to connect with my kids. I had to learn how to manage, keeping the connection, doing the therapy, listening, providing eye contact. And now that we're back in person, part of me misses the virtual because now we're all covered and I can't see their faces. And it's very hard for a speech language pathologist to do speech therapy with a mask but we're making it work. And
Yeah.
I think kindness is the main thing. But in terms of technology, we need a lot of education. And we, like I said before, we need to keep building that infrastructure, not to replace that content of the emotional interaction, but to help enhance it for people like Trishna and myself, who have to be very picky about where we choose to expose ourselves, because it is a risk. Taking it home to my parents, as I'm sure Trishna feels, would be so overwhelming. I don't worry as much for myself. I am triple vaccinated. I worry for my mom. I don't think she could survive COVID. And that is something that has changed my life completely. I go nowhere. I do nothing. And I hope that when life returns to normal, that people realize I did this for a better purpose.
Yeah. Thank you, Kelly. When we think about the over-reliance now that we've had to have on digital, I definitely want to bring Trishna your experience with this too, because that if you're as isolated as you may have been and your family has been, any kind of digital divide can feed or exacerbate the gaps in society. So I definitely, from your own personal experience and also from your experience with patient engagement, I would love to hear what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, certainly. That is the case. And actually, I think Kelly mentioned, she's already sort of touched on this. She said that when the pandemic happened, she already knew how to use Zoom. And so it was easier for her to move to virtual. She already had those skills. What we need to make sure is we don't end up with haves and have-nots, because the digital divide can, as you say, it feeds those gaps in the social determinants of health. And we don't want to be having people have poorer health outcomes because of that digital divide. So generally, in my experience, online systems can be basically quite poorly built from the user friendliness perspective. They can be hard to engage with. They can be time consuming. They're not being co-created with patients, particularly during the pandemic. Everything is being rolled out so quickly because there was a need to, but that meant that patients weren't being asked for input into systems. So just a specific example. So my GP surgery moved to a completely online booking system during the pandemic. Now, to be perfectly honest, is one of the most time-consuming, laborious, and user-unfriendly systems that I've ever used. And I'm technology savvy. My mum, who isn't technologically savvy, she's now scared of falling ill because she has no hope of being able to use this system. And she feels like she's lost her independence because she always needs to ask myself or my sister to make appointments for her now. I know some people who are just giving up and just hoping that they'll get better. And this also applies, I think, for things like for patient monitoring apps and things like that. So one of the aims is to improve outcomes because, you have better or more sensitive disease monitoring with these monitoring apps. Well, what about people who can't use them, who don't have access to the technology? Does this mean that they're going to end up having poorer outcomes? These are the things which I think we really need to be thinking about now, because so many people have been moved to virtual and to digital. We have to ensure that there's an equitable opportunity there to have those better outcomes which access to technology can provide. And that, like I said, we don't end up with these haves and have-nots. And it increases that gap.
Thank you so much for that. I think there are comments about how Zoom has been a very helpful tool for patient communities to stay engaged. And obviously it's not a replacement for in-person engagement. And you may even draw different people who arrive to in-person events, in community events, who simply get more disconnected from this. So it's a great point. Pushing beyond traditional engagement tools of email and events, communities have also pursued collaborative, data-driven projects like never before. It's been a time where we really had to go out with many surveys, many different approaches, and then there was survey exhaustion. So then it became a matter of, okay, well, we need to invest directly then in care and support technology that will help us collect more data during the conversations we're having. So let's talk about some of the patient friendliness of the new platforms and the CRO products and, other sponsored trials and apps and portals and anything like that, if you've got some experience with that as well. Trishna, I'll start with you. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, so it goes back to that whole, well, firstly, things need to be co-created. That it's just a given. Like, there is absolutely no reason why things cannot be co-created with patients. We all know now that that's where the best developments happen. But I think what's really important to remember is it's not about just giving these new tools and apps to patients. The organizations that are developing them and giving them to the patients need to make sure that they're investing in that training and support and the education as well, because that is just as important as the development of whatever tool or app or whatever piece of technology it is. Success will basically be largely a function of that. If you don't have the training and support and you've been given something that you're not able to use, or you don't have the confidence in using, either you're not going to use it properly or you're going to stop using it completely. And then you just have to think, well, what's the point? And also, I think the other thing which I feel very strongly about is we need to ask ourselves, do patients have continuous access to their own data? So whatever patient-reported outcome they're inputting into an app, for example, they're investing in this. They're investing their time and effort and energy, potentially even more so than doing a trial site visit. So if they're investing that much and they want to see their data, and have it reflected in terms of what I say, in terms of their own progress, so it's in a way that they can understand, they should have that opportunity, because it also gives people the opportunity to learn more about their condition and to learn more about how to self-manage properly and confidently, which again we know is going to continue to be important. It's been important during the pandemic. It's going to be important moving forward as well, because even when potentially things start returning to normal, healthcare systems have got waiting lists as long as, longer than my arm. And people are going to be expected to take responsibility for their own healthcare and self-manage and make some of these decisions themselves. So that, I think that, like I said, that ability to understand your data and learn more about your condition and how to manage it, I think will be really important, and technology can enable that.
Great, thank you. Kelly?
Yeah, well, again, my organization, as I had said before, AiArthritis, we were virtual and we were also global. But when I would go to conferences and I would be sitting around with researchers and doctors and pharmaceutical reps, they would say their biggest problem is getting patients to participate in research. And they were questioning whether virtual research, what can we do moving forward with that? Well, my organization had started a platform to do that. Patient-centered research, it was virtual. We have an outreach. We're able to recruit people. But the beautiful part about being virtual, they say, in the patient community, you might have 20% of the patients who would be willing to participate in research, but most of them don't have access because of location. So now virtually you're opening up access, but is it going to be valid research, or what are going to be the little blips that can happen? So we actually did a patient-centered research project. We were able to train the patients. I was one of the moderators. I went through training, how to ask guiding questions, how to not allow my opinion to influence anything moving forward. It wasn't easy, and I learned a lot doing that. But I think the main thing that Trishna said, once it finished, we had so many of the participants reach out to us and say, so what happened with the data? They wanted to know. So if only 20% of the population is going to want to participate in these research things, let's try and open it up to that full 20% by having, virtual options. And I think, like Trishna said, having the patients involved in the development of these programs. I'm a patient, I work with a patient-led nonprofit. We build everything from the patient's perspective, and we also work with the other stakeholders so that we're making a platform that is suitable for moving forward, suitable for research, suitable for advocacy, suitable for education. So I think these things can be done. Again, it's the working on the infrastructure, it's taking the time to make those connections with organizations and with patient leaders who can really connect their communities to people who really want to build research programs that can access greater number of people to hopefully make things better for patients in the future. But I think, there's always issues with research and keeping things following a protocol. And as I've said before, here in the United States, the red tape of healthcare is its own language, working between all the different government approval sites and the CDC, and, it's all overwhelming. So it's not something that can be easily done, but I think it can be done in a way that's thoughtful and includes all of the stakeholders, including the patient voice.
Yeah. In thinking about the thoughtfulness and the inclusivity or inclusiveness of it, Trishna, with all this technology adoption, there's always a danger that if you build it, they will come becomes the mentality. So what do you think are key ingredients that often get missed that make for slow adoption or for lower engagement than expected?
So I think one of the main things is, and I talk about this a lot when we're talking about this, the diversity piece in healthcare, is the expectation that, that patients will come to you. And it's about we have to go to them. You've got to be using the right channels. You've got to be targeting the right communities. You need to be making sure that you're partnering with the right organizations, the right patient leaders in order to reach the communities that you're trying to reach. But also, I think there's not enough talking. I think sometimes there can be some fear about doing the wrong thing. And then that makes organizations just step back and actually just do nothing. And that's not the right thing. Actually, if you start to open up the conversations and you have open and honest dialogue about where are the gaps, what's needed, what is it the community needs in order to actively participate in, whether it's patient engagement opportunities, whether it's helping to develop a new piece of technology, whether it's identifying unmet needs, etc. It's about making sure that dialogue is happening. I think it's also really important to remember that while technology has definitely opened up accessibility and has in many ways improved the diversity of patient engagement, it's meant that many people are coming to this for the first time, or they may not be as experienced. And what Kelly was saying about having to train herself on things like what you can and can't ask and having to, follow a protocol, I think that also becomes really important. Now, Europe is particularly highly regulated when it comes to patient industry interactions. So it becomes really important for patient organizations and individual patients and patient advocates to know what's allowed, what isn't allowed, how those partnerships can be framed so that you can move forward together in the most effective manner. And I think that's where you will start to get more diversity as people become more confident, they become more educated, not just in the things that you're developing, you're looking to get the insights you're looking to gain from them, but also just generally, how is it that industry works? How can we interact with them with industry in the right way? Because it can be scary, particularly if you're interacting with big pharma and you're thrown into a situation, let's say at a meeting, and it's very corporate, and they're talking maybe in language that you're not used to hearing. That can be very intimidating. And so it's about making sure that we make people feel comfortable, they understand what to expect, that the transparency is there. I think that is really crucial for moving forward.
That's great. Thank you so much. When we think about diversity and inclusion and all of the additional considerations, I think we have to get into the business considerations as well of running nonprofits, of running organizations with limited budget, with limited resources and enormous amount of need to address. So Kelly, I kind of wanted to turn it back to you a little bit about organizational structure and being remote versus being brick and mortar and what you've learned as well.
Well, we've always talked for years how it would be great to have a brick and mortar building where we could have meetings and we can hold events. And I think what we learned from the pandemic is we were actually a few steps ahead of the game with being virtual and having meetings on Zoom this whole time and having connections that really required us to be virtual. The only thing it really changed is that we're not going to conferences like we used to. And we're not, certain things in the beginning were canceled. This year they're up and running, but they are virtual and we have the technology to keep moving forward. We're still partnering with various stakeholders on projects, including the advocacy and education and research. And I think in terms of nonprofits connecting and funding and all those things, it's always I work with an amazing woman who really gets us the connections we need so we can better help our community. But I think in terms of education, it's something Trishna said before, getting the right patient leaders, getting the right nonprofits to link together, but also knowing that even though it's outside of our comfort zone, we can learn how to better connect people with research and with advocacy. Again, none of us went to school for this, but I think we're all intelligent people who really want to make a positive difference. Reach out to people like Trishna and myself and other nonprofits that really want to make positive changes and are already known to be working with stakeholders. A lot of times you'll see the bigger organizations that have been around forever that do a great job. And people wonder, well, why do you have that nonprofit for autoimmune and autoinflammatory arthritis? Well, because we felt that our voice, even though it was represented there, we wanted to feature it a little bit more, so there are ways that we can all work together to improve community engagement and to keep expanding that awareness of what patients need. And to make sure, especially during COVID, there was so much disinformation. And again, some of it became a political divide. At the end of the day, patients needed to get good information to go to their doctors. I was in a book group and patients were talking about, oh, my rheumatologist said I can't get the booster or I can't get the vaccine. And we were kind of like, wait, my rheumatologist said this. And it got into a little discussion and we ended up doing podcasts with doctors from Harvard and Stanford and Washington University. And we talked about what the American College of Rheumatology was saying and, what doctors should be telling their patients. And we found that not to be so accurate. So our organization really put out some solid information so that patients could actually see what was the medical recommendation and what was the science behind it. A lot of times doctors don't see that information or they might receive it in an email. So I think in terms of reaching out to them, maybe the emails aren't enough. Maybe there needs to be more meetings virtually online, although where people come up with all that time, I don't know. But I think the engagement and reaching out to nonprofits is huge because we're here to make a difference. Team up with us so that we can make things better for the communities and for the stakeholders.
Understanding.
I think what you've just said, Kelly, it really just wraps up everything about what's happened during this pandemic. It's about collaboration because every single stakeholder in the healthcare ecosystem has had its own challenges, and it's not about each individual stakeholder trying to do it all.
Exactly.
There's no point, each individual stakeholder, whether it's the nonprofits and patient associations, whether it's industry, whether it's healthcare and clinicians, whether it's patients and patient advocates, they all have their strengths. So it's about collaborative working to bring together those strengths, because everybody's working towards the same thing at the end of the day. And it's about bringing in those different stakeholders so that you can play on those strengths. And then where there are challenges, and there have been challenges. I mean, I was speaking to somebody just yesterday, and she's involved in an international umbrella organization. So it's a global umbrella organization for national patient organizations in a certain disease area. And she was just saying that so much of her time these days is spent trying to get funds to just be able to finance the projects. And she said, so her attention is being taken away from actually providing the services and the support, because so much of the revenue has been cut during the pandemic. So that's an area where other stakeholder groups, for example, industry could potentially help. And then the nonprofits and the charities are able to then go back to providing those essential services which are needed, and not have their attention taken away elsewhere. Because there's been some absolutely fantastic services that have been provided by nonprofits during the pandemic, utilizing technology. So, things like virtual peer-to-peer support and group therapy sessions, which has made the services more accessible to people in a way that has never been done before. So I think we have to remember, we shouldn't just get stuck in our own world, if that makes sense. It's about, coming together and making sure we play to those strengths, so that it's essentially, it's a win-win for all, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I said this when we were discussing this earlier. I feel like the mental health industry really set the bar very high during COVID with their outreach. My human resources department is constantly sending out things, because all of us are experiencing trauma as a result of COVID, whether it's directly impacted you, or it's caused you to change where you work, or it's caused you to lose your job, or like me, if you've lost multiple family members. There is a level of trauma with COVID, and the mental health industry has really done a great job of reaching out to companies, reaching out to insurance companies, making sure that patients know, hey, just click on this button and we can get you services. And a lot of times I think one of the barriers to accessing any sort of medical service can oftentimes be money. They've made services very affordable during this period. And I hope that continues, because mental health crisis can occur at any time. But I found a lot of people during this past year, myself included, I have been experiencing severe depression. I've accessed services, and it's been a lifeline for me. And I think seeing what they have done and how they've reached out, it would be amazing if we could have that across the board in terms of every kind of ologist, whether it's an endocrinologist, rheumatologist, cardiologist, that we can have that sort of outreach moving forward. But again, it's the education of the doctors and the nurses, because a lot of them, when we go into a doctor's appointment, we have our agenda because our health is very personal to us. Our doctors have a different agenda because they have to look at our symptoms, match it up with medications, and look at the scientific. So that's why a lot of times there's people feel like their doctors aren't hearing them. But I think if we can learn how to have more of an outreach and have the patients actually see the data, see the reasoning behind some choices, I think there would be a much healthier sort of interactions between patients and doctors. And that would eventually lead to more positive interactions with the other stakeholders like big pharma and research, and insurance. So I think it would be a win-win for everybody. Again, I have grand ideas. I don't know how to implement them, but I think things can be done to improve patient engagement, patient adherence, and it can be done with the help of digital. But as Trishna keeps saying, we cannot have the have and have nots. It shouldn't be the elderly can't access it because they don't know how to use the devices. It can't be lower economic groups cannot access because they don't have a digital device. I think there needs to be community-based resources to help with those have-nots, I guess.
I think that's that'll be I think a recurring theme that we find from our community as they ask more about what you've observed and learned about the transition to hybrid and beyond. We can't really walk away from people that we've engaged virtually to just go back to where we were. We can't just go back to being in person and somehow forget or try to erase the many, many people we've touched and reached and who've reached out to us through virtual channels now. So what have been some observations that you've seen about how to go about sustaining a hybrid model and understanding that? I mean, and I'll share from a Global Genes perspective, we were challenged like everybody else. As you know, this very summit has its history, deep roots in being a great, family-centric and caregiver-centric and patient-centric event in person. And we were impacted like everybody else through the pandemic and had to really reinvent that experience and generate more ongoing, cyclical, basically regular engagement with everybody that goes through the year and through multiple events. There's significant cost to that. And it forced us to take a more data-centric strategy of, thinking with the end in mind of what does it look like for somebody to continue to progress or stay engaged with us over time with a variety and more personalized approach. So, I think I'll lead the question a little bit to you in terms of how have you maybe invested or seen investment in personalization since it's so core to a digital and hybrid approach? Trishna, I'll start with you.
Yeah. So I think the thing that we need to remember is that at the beginning of the pandemic, things are being done out of necessity. Now we're able to take that breath, take a step back and think, okay, how do we sustain this? How do we make sure that we're in this for the long term? Because this has changed. The pandemic has changed the way that everybody lives. When we're talking about communities that have health conditions, we're not just going to go back to the way things were. It's just not going to happen. COVID's going to stick around. And I think we've had the opportunity and we've seen what it can be like to have a whole world made accessible to us. And so I think we need to remember that, and organizations have to bear in mind that for some people, the way that they interact and the way they want to interact has essentially changed forever. I mean, I would take this conference, for instance. If this had been in person, I would have had to take probably a week and a half off work. But I've not had to. I can come, I can attend sessions, I can speak. I had a dental appointment earlier this afternoon. I had a filling done, and I'm still able to come and speak and share my experience and share my expertise. That wasn't possible. I mean, advocacy can be exhausting. And, just before the pandemic hit, I was flying everywhere. I was traveling so much at speaking at conferences and meetings and things like that. I don't want to go back to that because actually it wasn't hugely great for my health. I was constantly having to manage, my fatigue. And this has, for me, virtual has been absolutely fantastic in that way. And so I think organizations have to remember they're investing in the future. They're investing in a more accessible future. They're going to be reaching a broader audience. And now we have the time to think, how can we do this properly? Because like I said, at the beginning of the pandemic, things were being rolled out really quickly. It wasn't necessarily being done in the right way or with the correct tools or through the correct channels. It was just, we have to do something. Now we have the time to think, okay, this is going to be the future, essentially. How can we form those partnerships, whether it's technology partnerships, whether it's funding partnerships, how can we form them in order to make it happen? Because as Kelly said, some of the organizations that were already used to the virtual environment, they're the ones that were doing really well at the start of the pandemic. well, moving forward, it's the organizations that are going to fully embrace technology, and they're going to find ways to make it work for not necessarily everyone, the vast majority of people, that I believe are going to be the ones that are going to do well in the future, and they're going to reach the patients that they need to reach. They're going to be able to interact better with industry, etc. I don't know what Kelly, what you think.
No, I think as soon as you just said what you said, I saw it as when all of this hit, organizations, companies, schools threw out a really big net, and whoever could catch on, caught on. Yeah. And now we're at a point where now we have to think how to thoughtfully engage and connect. And I think we've gotten a lot better with it. I think with technology changing and growing, just a simple thing today, which I thought was hysterical. I had said, I just really hope my dog doesn't start barking during this. And somebody said, oh, there's a mute button to suppress. And I'm like, how did I not know this? All these times I've had meetings with my dog barking. So again, they probably didn't have that a year ago. They have it now because it was a need that arose. So I think that thoughtful connectivity, years ago, I found most organizations in healthcare were concerned, how do we access patients through social media? That was a big thing. And now I feel like it's gone so far beyond that to how do we meaningfully engage patients virtually? So it's not even just social media, it's making those positive connections and making sure it's beneficial to all parties involved. Just because, for example, my mom, I wanted her to do a virtual appointment. Her one doctor's office doesn't do it. They just don't do it. And I don't know if it's because of the age of the staff and the doctors, or if it's just something they don't have funding to do. That could very possibly be the answer. But I was thinking to myself, I was seeing my rheumatologist virtually up until this last time. And she said, are you feeling good about coming in? I'd really like to see you. And I went in, and it was nice to be around her, but to know I have that option to not have to go in is huge. To know I have that option with several of my doctors is huge, because again, my life has changed to not just protect myself, but to protect my mom. And that is my utmost concern at all times. So I think everything that you've said, we have to move forward in a way that's more thoughtful, focuses on that infrastructure and that education of how to really use this, but also include that patient voice. We have a lot we can offer. We can tell you things that work for us and don't work for us. I think the biggest thing with patient adherence, they used to send out text messages. Senior citizens went crazy. They were getting text messages and they didn't know why. And they were so afraid they had to respond. Again, there was no education as to why. It was just, write down your cell phone number if you have one. Well, they didn't know why they were writing it down. So a lot of people were getting very upset about that. Having access to our family members in nursing homes is another thing that's very difficult. Some places have done an amazing job connecting family members, but people who are used to talking to somebody every day suddenly can only talk to their family member once a week, if that. That's a huge thing. So we need to be more thoughtful. We need to make the access available to a greater number of people. And I think that the bottom line is building up the infrastructure so that we can actually have the basis to expand it. So the funding and all these things that we need to do to put into this to make it a reality, it's going to take time, but it definitely can be done. And I think it should be done with all stakeholders, including the patient.
We've spoken at two different kind of altitudes during the session when it comes to being patients and caregivers within the care system, as well as leaders among leaders in the audience in the community about how to engage our own communities and get more of our work done despite the challenges of being remote. So I wanted to circle back to that first part or this latter point about the community leadership side with you, Kelly and Trishna, about really what we've learned, and you may corroborate it, is email became overwhelming. And while response rates for open rates may have stayed the same, the ability to stay on top of individual events, who's doing what, became the number one question we were constantly being asked at Global Genes as kind of a hub organization for so many rare disease organizations doing so many different things. How much of the direct human kind of interaction has remained critical to you as far as being in those Zoom calls among other leaders in small groups and just doing word of mouth reminders and promotions of different programs to make sure people were aware versus direct digital postings in social media and email, et cetera?
I think it's been crucial. I tell you the reason why, because you're right, there should be so much digital. And, whereas before I would read every email, mail shot that was sent to me. Now I look at the sender and think, am I going to open this or shall I just delete it? Because actually I don't have time, because now I have like 1,000,001 emails in my inbox. Even on social media, I've actively reduced the amount of time that I spend on social media, going through things and looking at Facebook groups and things like that, for the only reason that I'm in front of a screen all day. And that's exhausting. And so I think having things which are more targeted and more personalized and being able to say, so for me, I love having, video Zoom calls, because for me, I can put the face to the name. We can have, it might be a slightly long conversation, but for me, it's more meaningful. And, it means that things aren't being lost in the what I call the bump of, all the other stuff that comes in. I think that's really, moving forward, I think that's going to continue to be important, because also the other thing that we have to remember, that there's been a lot of burnout in terms of sort of digital. Like I said, people are just spending so much time in front of their screen, but also burnout in terms of, because there is so much more that can be done virtually and digitally in, for example, in the patient advocacy arena, people in certain ways have been doing more, and it does get tiring. And we have to always come back to the fact that the vast majority of patients and patient advocates and people who are, involved in nonprofits and charities, they're all people living with health conditions, many of whom haven't even been able to necessarily see their doctor during the pandemic. So potentially their health conditions might have worsened. And so again, it's about how do we make this sustainable so that we can take time to breathe. We are using it more effectively, because at the start of the pandemic, and I think even to some extent, even now, we're still in that, oh my goodness, we have to do something, and we haven't quite thought about how we're going to do it, to make sure we don't get lost in essentially all this digital, I can't think of a better word than bump, really. And make sure that, the messages that need to go out are being heard and then not getting lost.
Thank you. We're down to our last minute here, so I wanted to share, there are a couple more questions that were very good questions for our speakers that I think will be a good fit for conversation. We may not be able to get to them now because I think they're a little bit involved as far as how to manage your telehealth appointment when your doctor is not very engaged in you, and another very good one about what comes next in terms of how much coverage there will be by administrators for virtual versus in person. So I think we're going to pick those up in the discussion area, because I think there will be quite a few people who have some good opinions as well as our speakers on that. I wanted to thank our speakers so much for presenting today. Thank you to the audience as well. There's a lot more to come when it comes to sharing how we stay engaged, comparing notes. I think it's a great conversation to continue as well in the discussions, and with future Zoom calls as well. I think we're all constantly comparing notes and sharing together. I will offer one piece of advice that I've heard is make sure with your volunteers, tell the stories back to them. Data reflection is not only for patients, but for volunteers and staff, and remind them of the impact people have when they participate and they contribute, because it's a way of re-incentivizing and reminding people what the impact of your mission is, and that they are a part of it. But with that, thank you both, Trishna and Kelly, so much for joining us today. And stick around for our closing remarks and for some networking time as well after that. Thank you, everybody in the audience.